The Mystical Evolution in the Development and Vitality of the Church, Part 16. Yet, the interest in which mysticism arouses today among so many unbelievers who cannot deny the reality of these marvelous events, and therefore try to explain them by natural means, or in any manner they can, should put to shame and confusion many Catholics. Among these are some few religious and ecclesiastics who should know these matters profoundly in order to direct souls with accuracy and to orientate their own souls. Instead, they look on mysticism with the most shameful, indeed criminal, indifference, as if it were no importance to them to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God within us. The incredulous, with their obdurate hearts, however much they claim to be impartial, can neither see nor understand the mystery which is hidden in these phenomena. They see the basic uniformity with which, in the midst of an almost unbelievable variety of expressions, the mystics speak, though many of them have never read or heard anything of what had happened to the other souls. Their sincerity, penetration, delicacy of sentiment, and perfect equilibrium cannot be denied. Yet the unbelievers reject all this unanimous and imposing testimony. What is lacking that would make these facts credible? Nothing. Credibilia facta sunt ninis. What is lacking is the disposition to receive these reports and the sense to appreciate them. Yet these phenomena remain, and without the one true explanation, intimate communication with God, the facts will always remain enigmas. How can one explain the undeniable fact that so many simple and unlettered souls, in a moment of their loftiest contemplation, acquire a prodigious knowledge with which they, later, astound the greatest theologians? Such souls have been numerous. Hildegard, Angela Foligno, Catherine of Siena, Catherine of Genoa, Catherine of Bologna, Ruysbroek, Joseph of Cupertino, Nicholas Factor, Teresa of Jesus, Rose of Lima, Marina de Escobar, Agreda, Emmerich, Teigi, Sister Barbara, Gemma Galgani, Benigna Consolata, and many others. And such souls are in our midst today. We have had occasion to deal with some of them who, having read no other book but that of Jesus crucified, the true book of life, astonished us when we saw what sublime and marvelous experimental knowledge they had concerning the adorable mystery of the Trinity and of the mysterious workings of the Holy Ghost in the souls of the just. St. Teresa observes, quote, "The soul suddenly finds itself learned, and the mystery of the most holy Trinity, together with other lofty things, is so clearly explained to it that there is no theologian with whom it would not have the boldness to contend in defense of the truth of these marvels." Thus, although the soul cannot express what is ineffable, when it speaks of the divine attributes which are to some extent communicable, it is able to find certain analogies, but it must express in human language, and as best it can, the lofty mysteries of faith. Appreciating that the reality infinitely transcends the representation and that human words will always be deficient, nevertheless, according to our mode of understanding, the soul will speak with a loftiness and precision that amazes and confounds the most learned masters. The reason for this is that in a single, very simple idea which God infuses in them in an instant, these persons receive the plenitude of a vast science. St. Teresa adds, quote, "It is like one who, without having learned anything, or having taken the slightest trouble in order to learn to read, or even having ever studied, finds himself in possession of all existing knowledge. He has no idea how or whence it has come." Unquote. The science which those unlettered persons thus received and retained is possessed by means of an infused idea, which they so assimilate that later they can use it as their own. But from the other higher and substantial concepts, souls are not able to retain such clear ideas. They can only recall that they had them and that they were fully aware of seeing the ineffable by means of the great enlightenment which they so marvelously experienced. But the vision passes quickly, and afterwards they are not only unable to relate it, since it is inexplicable, but neither can they reproduce it interiorly, for it is inconceivable. Hence, we must admit that it was not the light of an infused created idea, but the immediate impression of the divine reality itself, which later hid itself from them and left them in obscurity. The fact can clarify many things, and perhaps even settle the much debated question of whether such souls sometimes see God intuitively, as do the blessed, or whether they see him by means of an infused species. Some theologians, too much inclined to the speculative aspect of the theology and lacking in experience, devotion, and even the true Christian sense, have a ready tendency to include all these supernatural operations which the narrow molds as their own psychology, and even try to formulate such matters in adequate syllogism. They try to reduce these things to species and forms, and so many abstractive notions. Consequently, they believe that in this life never, or at least very rarely, and then by a stupendous miracle, can the divine essence be communicated directly to the soul in such a way that it would serve the soul as an intelligible species. But truly experienced theologians, and especially the great mystics who have such a vivid awareness of these lofty truths, are not content with speaking of abstractive notions and speculative concepts. They speak to us also of truly concrete and immediate perceptions of the divine reality itself. Although they frequently recognize the infusion of permanent ideas, they do not regard the great transitory vision of the divinity as an essentially abstractive, but as intuitive, as works of that Spirit who scrutinizes all things, even the depths of God, and with whom these souls are identified. He who adheres to God is one spirit with him. These concepts which souls thus receive are not abstract, but concrete, living, and palpitating. And the knowledge which the Spirit of understanding and wisdom communicate to them is not speculative, but experimental. Without any intermediary, they feel, taste, see, and hear the ineffable God himself, God of one and three, after the manner of the blessed, though much more imperfectly, and for a very brief time, according as the grade of their purification and the condition of this mortal life permit. They feel that God is truly united to their souls and intellects. They hear the voice of his word, and they see and know him with the self-same clarity which he receives from the Father. They find themselves made one with God, and in the divine light they see the true and eternal light. In fine, they are certain, with an absolute certainty, of seeing, experiencing, and touching God himself immediately, and not through the medium of any image, representation, or abstraction, however lofty these may be. Therefore, souls say that during such moments they enjoy a prelude of glory, an anticipated glory, and that God dwells in them as in another heaven, so that what others know by faith, they know by vision. The light which they receive shares more in the light of glory than in the ordinary light of faith, which is through a mirror and in a dark manner. For although there is still a certain obscurity, since they cannot yet stand such splendor, what they see or perceive is the divine essence itself, in which they are, as it were, transformed because of the intimate union which makes them one thing with God. So the Eternal Father said to St. Magdalene of Pazzi, quote, "A fruit of the communication of my essence is a kind of disappearance of faith. By means of that communication I infuse in you my knowledge, which is so profound, clear, and intimate, that it seems to pertain more to vision than to faith." Unquote. The Venerable Marina de Escobar assured her confessor, Father Luis de la Puente, that she had seen the divine essence, contemplating God face to face, and noted that she saw him as do the saints in heaven. Saint Alphonsus Rodriguez made the same affirmation, and many years before him, the remarkable Virgin of Siena testified to it also. All these testimonies are well in accord with the doctrine of the angelic doctor. Although such souls see the divine essence directly and immediately, it is for a short time, sometimes like a lightning flash, and only in the measure of they are capable of receiving the light which God imparts to their intellects. Thus is disclosed to them now one attribute, now another. Only after the spiritual marriage which the soul is strengthened is the divine essence manifested in a clear and permanent manner, so that they enjoy a quasi-habitual vision of the mystery of the Trinity. Thus, whenever the soul recollects itself, it is conscious of the presence of the three divine persons. Sometimes neither sleep nor great occupations impede the soul from enjoying this loving vision, and the soul lives among men after the manner of the angels who are charged with our care. That vision makes souls completely happy, and up to a certain point they are happy even in the midst of the greatest sufferings. But since the vision is often accompanied by a certain obscurity which causes great anxiety and impulses, and since frequently it is ordained to further purification or to make souls serve as expiatory and propitiatory victims for the good of the entire Church, that ineffable pleasure is generally associated with intolerable martyrdoms of love, at least until the spiritual matrimony is reached. This participation in the sorrows of Christ, like the sharing in his glories, is characteristic of all his faithful imitators who have reached the state of configuration with him. Saint Teresa, in the midst of the most delicate and almost continual favors which she merited, affirmed that she had not passed a single day without great sufferings. The very ecstasy produced by the gentle divine touch, and especially the rapture which absorbs souls in an inaccessible light, although always delicious and salutary, are at the same time most painful. This proceeds not only from the condition of these souls, but also from the special attributes which God manifests and other complementary knowledge which he adds. When he discloses to souls his infinite sanctity and justice and his supreme aversion for sin, and also makes them see and feel their own nothingness and wretchedness, then the same time they swoon away in love and are cast in a most profound sorrow. This sorrow penetrates to their very bones and leaves them prostrate for days without any strength. The greater the light they receive and the appreciation they have of God, the greater is their prostration, abasement, and self-contempt. and it seems to them that all hell would be little to atone for their ingratitudes. Thus is understood their profound annihilation and prodigious humility, as deeply felt as it is sincere, which makes them regard themselves as nothing in the midst of the great favors they experience. They see themselves sanctified and deified, and they feel themselves radiant with divine knowledge and power. Yet they are totally prostrated and attribute nothing to themselves. Amid the great divine favors which they receive, they are confused and filled with ardent desires to make known their nothingness and the infinite mercies of Him who had thus enriched them. So Saint Teresa adverts that true humility does not consist in ignoring the excellence of the gifts received from God, but in recognizing them in order to give thanks for them and not to appropriate the glory to oneself. Quote, "Because he that is mighty hath done great things for me." Unquote. In the like manner, when God shows these souls the great evils in the Church, the necessity for expiation, the crimes of so many Christians, the sacrileges of unworthy priests, the horror of schisms and dissensions which threaten to dislocate the members of the mystical body, and the force with which this whole weight of sin oppressed the Savior in the garden, then they truly share in his agony and bloody sweat and accompany him in all his sacred passion. They help him to carry his cross, and across the centuries they prolong the sacrifice of Calvary. But if they bear always the mortification of Jesus, the very life of Jesus is also clearly manifested in their mortal bodies. Although they find their way strewn with crosses, through them they receive for themselves and for others the salvation and the life that will enable them to enjoy, in spite of all things else, an anticipated glory. By means of the spirit of revelation which they possess, they are the light of the world. By means of their continual sufferings, they are the salt of the earth. Alas, the day when such souls should be lacking. But such souls will never be wanting. In spite of all the malice of the world, such souls will continue to appear as there is need for them, and more abundantly. May the Lord give us his spirit of revelation, in order that we may know and love him and be able to appreciate as we ought the grandeur and the splendor which he deigns to grant to his faithful servants. The saints carry on the Savior's mission. With him they are placed as a sign of contradiction, and at the same time they save the judge of the world. They who hear and accepts them, hears and accepts Jesus Christ himself, and thus finds light, salvation, and life. He who despises the saints despises Jesus Christ, and, not being moved by their heroic example, he incurs the most terrifying judgment. Such a one has already judged himself. Appendix 1. Wise ignorance and presumptuous knowledge. St. Catherine of Siena, from the Dialogue, chapter 85. The presumptuous learned ones, blinded by their pride and self-love, are deprived of the light by which the Scriptures were formed and declared. Thus, in their reflections, they taste only the letter, and not the substance of the doctrine. Therefore they marvel and even murmur when they see that unlettered persons surpass them in the knowledge of truth, and possess it as if they had studied for a long time. But this should not cause astonishment, for such souls possess the principal font of light from which science emanates. Therefore it is better to seek salutary advice from these humble and upright persons than from the learned persons who are proud. I say this, my daughter, that you may know the perfection of the unitive state, in which the eye of the understanding is attracted by the fire of my charity, wherein supernatural splendors reside. By that light illumined souls love me, because love follows upon understanding, and the more they know, the more they do love, and the more they love, the more they know, for the one is nourished by the other. By this light they arrive at the eternal vision wherein they truly taste me. This is that most excellent state in which, even though mortals, they rejoice with the immortal. Many times this union is so great that they know not whether they are in the body or out of it, and they are reunited with me in such a way that they enjoy even now the pledges of eternal life. In this way, by contemplation, St. Thomas says, there is effected in us a certain inchoation of beatitude, which begins here and will be continued in the future. 2. The secret word and the sensation of the ineffable. Blosius, Institutes, chapter 12. Blessed is the soul that is dedicated to the cultivation of purity of heart, and exercises itself in holy introspection, that renounces self-love and its own will, and seeks itself in nothing. Such a soul merits to approach closer and closer to God until, elevated, illumined, adorned with divine grace in its higher faculties, it attains to unity and nudity of the spirit and a pure love and simple knowledge without images. Its faculties shine like the stars, and it is made capable of contemplating with serene, simple, and joyful gaze the abyss of the divinity. The natural light of the intellect is blinded by such clarity. It perceives nothing as temporal, but, rising above time and place, it takes on the characteristic of eternity. It sees by experience that God transcends all corporal and spiritual representation, and that all could be said or thought of him, for it clearly perceives that all this is infinitely removed from the truth of the divine essence, which is in itself indescribable. It rests in that hidden and lovable God whom it feels, for the divine light, by its excessive brilliance, is accessible, and for that reason is called a darkness. There is a soul receives the secret word, which God speaks to it in the silence of its mind, and it experiences the close embrace of the mystical union. Swooning away, it empties itself in God, who is its peace and joy. The enamored soul is liquefied, I say, and it faints away. It is, as it were, annihilated, losing itself in the abyss of eternal love, where it dies to self to live in God, not feeling or knowing anything else but the love which it tastes. But the loss of self in divinity is rather a finding of self, because, being stripped of everything human and clothed in the divine, the soul is transformed and changed into God, as iron placed in the fire becomes fire. Nevertheless, the essence of the deified soul remains, just as the igneous iron does not cease to be iron. But that which formerly was cold is now inflamed, and that which was formerly darkness is now light, and that which was formerly hard is now soft. Yet it is now of a divine color, for its essence is absorbed in God. The whole soul is inflamed with the fire of divine love, and the whole soul is changed and passes into God and is united to him without any intermediary. It is made one spirit with him, just as gold and copper are fused into the one mass of metal. Oh, what a happy hour is that which the soul, experiencing the divine union, enjoys the prelude to eternal happiness. Then it experiences what no tongue can express and no reason can surmise. It is so firmly established in God that it feels closer to him than it does to himself. Thus does it now live a deiform and superessential life, being made conformable to Christ according to spirit, soul, and body. Now when it eats, drinks, keeps vigil, or sleeps, all these things are worked in it by God, who dwells in the soul in a superessential manner. God teaches the soul all things and opens to it the treasures of spiritual and mystical knowledge. With great frequency, he visits it, draws it to himself, caresses it, illumines it, inflames it, penetrates it, and fills it. The soul is now a clear and stainless mirror, and the rays of the wisdom and charity of the Sun of Justice are reflected in it. Dennis the Carthusian. When the Omnipotent manifests this light to the mind, he conquers it by the enormity of his greatness and the excellence of his majesty, perfection, and great brilliancy. All this is done in a moment, in the blink of an eye, and not violently, but sweetly. He oppresses the soul so that, overcome by love and stupefied with admiration for the immense clarity and majesty which is contemplated and the delicious serenity of the deity which perceives it, it will know nothing of self. Indeed, it is suddenly so greatly illuminated and inflamed that it immediately succumbs and loses its bodily powers and senses. Then is the mind led into the secrets of uncreated light and submerged in the abyss of infinite light. Enraptured, it is lost in the ocean of eternal happiness. Not knowing where it is or how it arrived, then the God of infinite pleasure makes known to the beloved that it is his possession, and the soul, spurning everything carnal and transitory, desires nothing but God. 3. Sufferings of the Servant of Christ. Emmerich, Life, page 41. I saw an enormous body, horribly mutilated, and raised up towards the heavens. The torso was covered with terrible wounds. Some were fresh wounds, that bled profusely, and others were covered with dead skin. On the side of the body was black, gangrenous, and corrupt. I experienced in myself all these sufferings, and then my guide said to me, quote, "This is the body of the church," unquote. Then, showing me each wound, he indicated to me a part of the world. I saw an infinite number of men and cities separated from the church, each in its own manner, and I felt this separation as painfully as if they had been separated from my own body. Then my guide said to me, quote, "Learn the meaning of your sufferings, and offer them to God with those of Jesus Christ, for those who have been separated. One member must invoke another, and suffer to cure him and unite him to the body." Sister Barbara, Vita, page 444. It is a painful sight to see souls who are not only run, but fly to precipitate themselves into hell. This is a martyrdom for me because I see that the blood of my God is rejected. With great sorrow I said to my God, quote, "Is it possible that so many souls, who have cost thee so dearly, will perish? Give to me the punishment which they deserve, and let them be saved. Put me at the gates of hell, so that no more souls may enter therein, for my heart cannot bear the pain of seeing more souls lost. Ah, Father, How great in my sorrow when I see my God so offended and I am powerless to remedy it. For if I were but able, I would give my life 1,000 times if it would thereby gain but one soul for God. Willingly I would undertake great sacrifices to make him loved, adored, and glorified throughout the world. Would that I could take into my hands the hearts of the whole world and consecrate them all to God. St. Magdalene de Pazzi, quote, "There is no greater suffering for a soul that loves thee than to see sinners unconverted. That is, not to see thee, O sovereign good, dwelling through the grace in thy creature, for whom thou hast suffered so much, to see thy blood shed in vain. Would that it were not so, my love. Let me rather die. Here is my body, my blood, my soul. I offer these to thee. Let fall upon me instead all the crosses, and the punishments and the torments of hell, so that the creatures made in thy likeness may be saved, and the lost sheep may return to the fold of the divine shepherd." 4. How the saints save and judge the world. Vice, Apologia, chapter 10, verse 24. In his merciful providence, God sent such a saint to remind the world of its duties and to save it from its corrupt life. The saints, whose lives are a flagrant contradiction to the world spirit in general and to that of their own age in particular, are selected as instruments of salvation by the compassionate Doctor of the nations. But he who does not accept them as mediators must accept them as judges, just as he must accept Jesus Christ, who did not come to judge the world, but to save it. John chapter 3, verse 17. Quote, "Know you not that the saints shall judge the world?" Unquote. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2. The world will be convinced of three things: of sin, of justice, and of the judgment. John chapter 16, verse 8. The world will be convinced of sin, and this judgment will be passed by the world itself, for its own conscience convince it of sin just as the punishments of God convince it of judgment. But it is further necessary that the world be convinced of justice so that it cannot accuse God of demanding the impossible. This judgment is reserved to the saints. Their lives, with their defects, their conversion, their punishments, their great struggles, their works of supererogation, constitute the book which they shall be judged. But the saints realize this task even here below and very plainly, however much others may close their eyes. Yet, for those who receive the saints, they are a great means of salvation. A people will never fall hopelessly into corruption as long as they have a single saint. Thanks be to God, saints are immortal, and even today they have not disappeared. God knows his own. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19. Let it not be thought that they exert scant influence because they do not make a great deal of noise. On the contrary, the more hidden they are, the more time they have to work. They exercise a great influence precisely because they do not waste time in calling the attention to the world upon themselves. There is not a single saint, even the most silent and humble, who did not possess the characteristics of salt, for every saint at least prevented the spreading of corruption. The importance of private revelations. From what has been said up to this point, one can understand the supreme importance of the interior teaching of the Holy Ghost in the Christian life. This is manifested not only in the continual illustrations which just souls receive, and in the marvelous assistance by which he preserves church councils and profits from errors, but also in his frequent revelations, sensible or intellectual, and in the gifts of prophecy and the discernment of spirits by which he continually favors so many souls. For he must always be making friends of God and prophets, and pouring forth his Spirit on young men and old. One will also understand the caution with which the Church and all prudent souls evaluate private revelations in order to test the Spirit and to judge whether they are of God, so as not to despise them or confuse them with the human errors which are liable to enter in, or the diabolical suggestions which strive to imitate them. These later suggestions can always be identified by their disguised and insidious attacks against the purity of our holy faith or pious customs. Human errors, on the other hand, can be distinguished by their emptiness and futility. We have already pointed out that the sensible visions and locutions with which God favors many pious souls in order to illumine them more clearly and distinctly, in accordance with their capacity, though of themselves very trustworthy, can nevertheless be the occasion of error and deception. This comes about by reason of the details which the soul is liable to add inadvertently, or by the soul's taking for a reality what is a symbol, or giving a material signification to words which God speaks in another sense. In successive locutions, error and confusion can enter into their very substance, for the soul composes the entire locution on its own account. But formal communications, and especially revelations which are entirely intellectual, whether locutions or visions, do not of themselves admit of any deception, for the soul receives them from God without doing anything to contribute to them. Yet there can be errors in the mode of expressing these revelations, as well as in appreciating, interpreting, and representing them. And all these errors are reducible to the human mind. In assimilating them for the purpose of understanding and expressing them better, the soul inadvertently and unintentionally introduces certain human elements which open the way to inaccuracies. Though the soul believes itself to be attempting only to understand what God speaks or manifests to it, actually it sometimes considers or interprets these things in its own manner. Therefore, in translating into human language some of the intellectual communications which are expressible, in spite of the fact that they are themselves luminous and lofty, the soul may distort them to a certain extent. Far different is the case of the spiritual concepts that proceed from the mysterious divine touch which makes the truth tasted. For, in that instance, the soul does not assimilate or interpret in a human manner, but, completely governed by the spirit of wisdom and understanding, it penetrates, feels, tastes, and touches these ineffable realities, not humanly, but in a divine manner. Thus, if any error manifests itself at the end, it is not in that pure and spiritual sensation, but only in the communication which is made to others. Granted the impossibility of faithfully translating it into human language because of the necessary disproportion and inaccuracy of all terms and symbols which, however noble they may be, are always infinitely removed from that ineffable impression of the divine. For this reason, souls thus favored feel a repugnance in speaking of these ineffable things for any motive whatsoever. They see clearly the inexactitude and lowliness of words, which seem to them to be not expressions of truth, but blasphemies. Therefore they repeat with the apostle, "These are secrets which is not lawful to utter." As regards more frequent locutions, when they are lengthy and repeated and when they are not purely intellectual, it is to be supposed that ordinarily they belong to the group of successive locutions, which are found in human interferences suspect of error. Therefore, certain credible writings can be distorted to a certain extent so far as they can be effected in this way. Even when the locutions have been transmitted at one stroke, by means of a simple idea which the soul later tries to penetrate and express in its own way, the same thing may happen, for the soul must reflect and compare, and thus it introduces many of its own personal evaluations. These personal evaluations are present even when the manifestations is made by the soul without any force or effort, and very graphic and expressive words come to the person's mouth or pen. For basically these things represent the soul's own resources, and for that reason in each compilation there is reflected the natural character of each person. Hence, in spite of the deserved credence which some of these writings enjoy, and the high esteem in which the Church holds them, since the human element is frequently to be found in each interpretation or compilation, especially if they were compiled or retouched by the hand of another, such writings are far from being infallible and may easily contain certain inaccuracies or false evaluations. Hence they do not always agree amongst themselves, even the most authentic and highly authorized of them. However precious they may be, private revelations cannot be compared with the public or canonical revelations, whose infallibility of interpretation and compilation is guaranteed by the inspiration itself. Yet private revelations do not on this account cease to be of great value for the edification of the faithful and the Church as a whole. They possess this value because they augment piety, excite fervor, and raise the spirit of the times, because they also contribute efficaciously to the promotion of disciplinary and liturgical progress, and even to the advance of dogmatic theology. Hence the spirit of revelation, which the apostle ardently desired for all followers of Christ, can never be lacking in the Catholic Church. Thus does the sovereign spirit of wisdom take delight in conversing with the children of men, that spirit who through nations conveys himself into holy souls and makes friends of God and prophets. He manifests to the little ones the prodigious treasures of grace and truth which are hidden from the wise and presumptuous. Who would not be filled with admiration at seeing the marvel of lights and the sublimity of concepts and souls thus enriched by the divine Spirit? Who would not be amazed at the nobility of language which they spontaneously employ whenever they express the word spoken by God or the Blessed Virgin, and while the things spoken on their own account are filled with simplicity and candor? Whence comes that loftiness of ideas and that elegance and purity of style in souls lacking all human culture? What power of suggestion could infuse in them at one stroke that remarkable science which they have never studied, and those sublime concepts which they have learned from no other person? This is a positive fact against which all human explanations are shattered. However much they may appeal to suggestion, contagion, telepathy, or any other influence which is not supernatural. St. Rose of Lima, afflicted at having to take away from prayer the time required to learn to read and write, asked God to instruct her, and suddenly, to the admiration of all, she found herself fully instructed. St. Catherine of Siena never learned to write or even to read, and therefore she had to find someone to read and write her copious correspondence. Yet she was able to dictate at the same time 2 or 3 or even 4 letters concerning the most weighty and varied matters, without ever losing the trend of thought and with a remarkable speed and sureness. She who had always been so weak was able to pass long periods of time with no other food than the Eucharist. With the strength which she received from this heavenly food, she could, in spite of her infirmities, undertake great enterprises, and by the light which it communicated to her, she was able to understand the contents of letters by merely glancing at them, although she would have been unable to spell out the meaning. She begged God to give her a knowledge of Latin in order better to profit from the prayers of the Church, and she was immediately instructed in that language. What could suggestion or telepathy avail here? And these things are not to be considered a rare event. Some of them are frequent. Many souls, on hearing certain verses of the Psalms or of the Canticle of Canticles, which pertained to them, especially in their present state, understood these verses clearly without knowing a word of Latin, and not only the literal sense, but even the mystical sense hidden beneath the letter. Others, on hearing them and not knowing Latin, could seek someone to translate them and would then immediately penetrate to their spiritual meaning. But it is not to be wondered that at the great mystics received such lights when they had as their master him who is wisdom itself. They were so illumined that they seemed almost to have granted them the lumen gloriae. Nor is it surprising that in the midst of their sufferings they should possess such powers, since rather than living on earth they were still wayfarers. They were already living in heaven, whereas they had their conversation and continually enjoyed ineffable delights, at the least of which incomparably surpasses all human joys taken together, and seems to them an excessive reward for all their labors. In such delights they saw the prelude and anticipated joy of eternal glory, whose exercise consists in knowing the one true God. They already knew and possessed him in the depths of their hearts, so that they lived in him alone and were transformed in him. O marvelous progress, whose limit is God himself! O truly prodigious evolution, which thus deifies us by transforming us into God! Will the enemies of light and progress still call us retarded, antiquated, and reactionary? Poor nearsighted men who do not see that their type of evolution is a revolution and a degradation, and that their progress is actually a retrogression. Their well-thought-out evolution casts them into an abyss lower than the plants, and their exaggerated progress stupefies them and buries them in mire and darkness. Poor autonomous reason which attempts to deify itself and be the absolute norm of anything, but is incapable of knowing the all of anything, or of making the least correction or modification in the divine operation. Poor foolish reason which, unable to understand the most significant thing or a single atom, presumes to pass judgment on the loftiest mysteries. Poor infatuated reason, blinded by the rays of the infinite light, prefers to pronounce its judgment and close its eyes and live in darkness like a nocturnal bird, rather than strengthen its vision with the virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Poor misguided reason, fleeing from the great, the noble, and the divine, which are the only things that can enrich and perfect it, cannot help but be degenerated, vitiated, and degraded. Desiring to be sufficient unto itself, it abandons itself to its own powers and busies itself with fatuities, or bagatelle, if not burying itself in uncleanness with obscures and perverts it. O reason, whatever you succeed in discovering apart from God, the more it enlightens you, the more it will disillusion and deceive you. Ultimately, it will avail you but little when, fleeing as you do from the very source of light and life, you end in the exterior darkness. If, by following the proud banner whose theme is, quote, I will not serve, unquote, you disown the loving God who redeemed you and regenerated you with his blood, and thus lose the torch of divine faith received at baptism, well, we can hear over you as over the cruel prince whom you have delivered yourself. Quote, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, who didst rise in the morning? But yet thou shalt be brought down into hell, into the depth of the pit. Unquote. But we are all beholding the glory of God with open face and are transformed into the same image from glory to glory as by the Spirit of the Lord.